The amber cliffs of Thebes, the desert that fringed the capital of ancient Egypt. A pitiless place where the men who made the king's tombs were born, worked all their lives, and died. Our villages were here over 3,000 years ago, and they're still here in this preserving desert, where little changes, a landscape filled with fragments of ancient life.
The ancient Egyptians used these cliffs like a scribbling pad. They wrote all over them. They recorded everything on them, from coronations to people's deaths and births, all sorts of things. Here, there's a very faint inscription. Now it's gone down gold with age, like the whole cliff. Written with the very practiced hand of a master scribe, a man called Amennakht, who worked on the royal tomb. And it tells us that he brought 3 of his sons out here with him. Youngest sons they were, because he had older ones that were by now already grown up. Amennakht himself would have been 45, 50-ish, a senior man at the village, indulgently taking the youngest of his large family on a big treat. What did they come here for? They came to the desert for a most extraordinary thing. They came here to see a waterfall. This is another waterfall, and this one's right at the head of the Valley of the Kings, right above the royal tombs. It's funny, you don't think it's raining much here in the desert, do you? In fact, it doesn't much. You only get a few spots a year here. But when it does rain in the desert, sometimes you get these terrifying electrical storms. And then a flood occurs because the rain comes down in buckets, hits the driest sand, and runs across the surface. And of course, it could come down off the Sahara anywhere down into the Nile Valley. Sometimes, of course, it can even come down into the Valley of the Kings, and you get this incredible mass of stones and sand just roaring through here. Happens in a minute, by the way. 1 minute is sun shining here, next minute the sky's dark, pink lightning, and boulders are smashing through the valley. Something the tomb workers were very, very aware of. And one terrifying night, it was just as well they kept watch, because it seems that none of them were hurt when the water came right down here, smashing through here, gouging these cliffs, tearing the bottom off that cliff, probably knocking over part of the rock there, and filling it right up till you get to this level here. You see, down there, some 40 foot lower, that was the old floor of the valley. The new floor of the valley, where the trembling, surprised workmen must have come and stood, was just here. And this is where they left their names and scratched little pictures of the gods, the great gods who caused these terrible events. They built their new settlement high above the Royal Valley on a little ridge, well out the way of any floods. It was much more lavish than anything they'd ever had before. And it had some most extraordinary features in it. This village has no kitchens in it. No cellars, no larders, no charcoal from cooking has ever been found here. In fact, it's only little places for sitting and sleeping. All the cooking was sent up from the village by the wives down below. And do you know, we've still got some of the orders the men sent home. Things that say, please send some more beans for my 2 brothers that have just turned up. And I suppose the women would trot up the path with bowls of steaming food for the men that lived up here. It's very odd, you know, the relationship between men and women in our village. Women came in several titles. There was, for example, a mistress of the household who was pretty posh and ran a lot of servants. Then there were other wives, more sort of common law wives, I suppose you might call them, who went out to work. They are called citizenesses by Egyptologists. They got good divorce settlements, and often their marriages broke up after 5 or 6 years, but they would argue it out and write down a written agreement between the parties, and people parted friends, and often men and women both circulated around different households in the village. But you know, the real crux of the relationship between men and women in this village is really the emotional one. And in that, They seem to show an advance on most other communities, really up until the last 100 years or so. And the clue to all this is the love poetry. Because in the love poetry you can see an equality of emotion between men and women. Both sexes fall in love. Both sexes have strong sexual emotions which are considered right and proper and beautiful, and they're expressed in the language of the religion, in fact. A lover will compare the beloved in the same way that a man will address his God. He will say, "You have hair of lapis lazuli, your perfume goes through me." And she will reply in exactly the same strong language. I think the love poetry, indeed, is some of the most beautiful things that our village has given the world, because that's where most of it was written.
The wild goose soars and swoops. It alights on the net. Many birds swarm about. I have work to do. I am held fast by my love. Alone, my heart meets your heart. Beloved of men who rules my heart. O happiness of this hour, let the hour go on forever. Since I have lain with you, you raised up my heart. Be it sad or gay, do not leave me. My lover is on yonder side. The river is between our bodies. The waters are mighty at flood time. A crocodile waits in the shallows. I enter the water and brave the waves. The crocodile seems like a mouse to me. I found my lover on his bed. My heart was overjoyed. Each said, I shall not leave you. My hand is in your hand. You and I shall wander in all the places fair.
None of scribe Amennakht's daughters would have worked upon the royal tombs. But within the tradition of hearth and home, village women enjoyed a high status, as is shown in several ancient medical papyri.
Egyptian doctors were really interested in women's disorders. They had more remedies, for example, for, say, curing the pain of childbirth or menstrual disorders than they did for digging arrowheads out of people or curing knife wounds. In fact, I think that is, if you just look at that alone, it's a very interesting reflection of the care and status of women in Egyptian society.
And nowhere is this more true than in the ceremonial that surrounded the act of childbirth.
And for that, the maternity bed was moved into the front room, the public room of the house where people normally came to gather in the evenings to sit and talk. It was just taken over for the whole rite that surrounded childbirth. First of all, the walls were painted out, not a bad idea, and on them were painted figures of the gods that you associate with childbirth. That's Taweris with the great round stomach, she's a hippopotamus god, and a little black dwarf called Bess who runs around banging a tambourine and for some reason was a great favourite of pregnant women. And then the ancestor shrine, which is in every one of these front rooms, was also adapted. You see, normally, this being the shrine, there were little figures of the gods standing along the back wall. And these were pushed back, and 2 columns of bricks were erected there. Now, the ancient name, really, for childbirth is on the bricks. That's the name for the event of childbirth. And that's where the woman sat, squatting, actually, in the most modern position. It's come right back into fashion, I suppose, in the last few years. And that is where the village lady gave birth to their children, right in the public area of the village. But in fact, they did have some privacy because this was decorated for the event. They put 2 wooden columns up and garlanded it all with lotuses and green plants and flowers, which people in the desert love so much, of course. What a sensible arrangement it was. Not only were they using the most modern techniques that we use today, but they were also taking the woman out of the normal environment of the house, away from whatever dirt was around, and putting her in a different and enclosed place. And there she sat for 30 days after childbirth.
يستطاع الجسم يجي يسير ولا يكون بحال عسير بأهدى الله ولا يغلب غالب على الله غالب.
Many of these practical household rituals have continued at Thebes to this day. Our ancient village held a family whose job was exactly the same as this man's. mysterious profession of catching snakes and scorpions with a mixture of skill and magic. And in the time of the ancient village, this man would have also been a doctor, treating everything from snake bites to ulcers.
If you look at the medical remedies, of course, then the modern doctors really put their noses up because they don't actually believe that if you mix up tortoise brains and peppermint oil and rub it on your right shoulder, it's going to help an ulcer. But in fact, it might just, and I tell you how. Because it shows a system of caring in the village. It shows a way of looking and sympathising with people. If, for instance, you look at a papyrus on eyes, you'll find it, on eye diseases, you'll find it has something like 20 or 30 different diagnoses. Very, very careful. Anybody looking that careful in the eye and cleaning it carefully and worrying about the patient seems to me is partway to a cure.
Ultimately, our village was controlled from the other side of the river. Scribe Amennakht had to walk down from the desert and cross these fields to the river and catch a ferry to see his boss. And at the landing, then as now, was a market. And still today, many of its goods will be well known to the ancient scribe. But today, some things are long gone, such as the slaves and the brightly painted coffins that the villagers made especially for this market, which would be swapped for food and clothes and other luxuries that the state did not supply. On the river, these fishermen could well be those of Amennakht's village, netting the tombmakers' evening meal. Hard-working men who had known the scribe well and who would serve his village faithfully for generation after generation.
As the head man of the village now, almost as the patriarch of the village, Scribe Amennakht would have been the one who came across this river many times a week on business for the community. That is, collecting the food, sending back tools, picking up the pigments for the paint for use in the royal tomb. This 3,000 years ago was an amazing sight because there weren't just these tourist boats there. There were the grain barks of Ammon. The god owned 40 or 50 of them, and they went up and down the river, bringing in the grain from the fields to the great temples. There are also more exotic vessels that have come across the Great Green, which is what the ancient Egyptians called the Mediterranean. There have been opium boats from the Mycenaean ports, cedar wood coming in from the Lebanon, juniper berries from Byblos, all sorts of rare and exotic things.
And at the heart of the great city, the vast temple of Karnak.
Der Aufbau des Säulensaales begann in der Zeit von Sethus dem ersten Vater von Ramses II.
Today, millions are drawn from all over the world to see what the ancient people made. But they come to a strange and puzzling place. Buildings speak in strange tongues, in an architectural language that few can understand. I wonder how many tourists go away overawed by the stones, yet puzzled by the central mystery in the place. What does it all mean? Where do these doors and colonnades and pillars and pylons and shrines and dark rooms lead? Filled with people, the place still seems empty, veiled.
One more thing. When Joseph, son of Jacob, explained the dream for the
This is the building's heart, a small empty room, but it provides no clue. But there is an intelligence at work here.
Now, the important thing to remember about Karnak Temple is that it isn't a church. There's no altar, no congregation. It's the secret house of a god. Basically, this is its geometry. It's the great long path that goes from the front door to the innermost recesses of the temple. And from that, the first architects, when they planned the temple out, drew two guidelines, same distance apart on each side of the main axis. And every building that went on that axis of that temple, every time they built a bit more, bigger and bigger and bigger, was guided by those lines that they'd already put down right at the foundation of the temple. And the distance apart of these lines was controlled by a series that we modernly call the Fibonacci series. It's not really so difficult, it just means that every number in it is the sum of the two previous numbers. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 3 and 2, 5, 5 and 3, 6, 7, 8, etc., etc. So that these measurements, which go in cubits, which is the ancient Egyptian measurements, about half a metre or something, goes 1 cubit, 2 cubits, 3, 5 and 8, and so on. Now that's a wonderful scheme, and it means you can go on building the building in harmony forever and ever. However, it does mean that in the last stages of the building, you're getting very, very big sizes indeed. So this is why the first pylon is absolutely vast. So it follows then that behind the great first pylon is the biggest and newest courtyard in the Temple of Karnak. Behind that, on the main axis, through the gateway over there, is the Hypostyle Hall. So here we are, the most extraordinary, one of the bravest ancient monuments in the world, and the biggest hall of pillars ever made, 134 of them. And it's brave in a way because these pillars are not set in straight lines like those in Greek temples, but they're made like a clump of trees. And in fact, that's what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a huge papyrus swamp. And these great piles of stone are meant to represent papyrus stems swaying gently in the wind. The Egyptians used their wonderful hall for many different things. The king's viziers and the high priests used to hold trials and commissions in here. And Amennakht, the village scribe, used to bring the copper chisels here for resharpening in the temple workshops. The most important single function of this hall was as a processional way for the gods. I'm moving now through the darkest, most mysterious part of the temple. The walls are coming in, the ceiling is coming up, the floor is coming down. We're coming to the apex of the triangle with the house of the god. And all around our god, in other little shrines, stand the small and mysterious shrines of the gods of Egypt. Unfortunately, when you get to the middle of Karnak, to the heart of the great temple, the god's gone, and the house where he stood, well, it's ruined. You can't really tell what went on. But once upon a time, only the king of Egypt and his closest delegates came in here, and they attended on the figure of Ammon, stood here on this stone. It's really difficult to see it today, but there are other temples in Egypt where you can get some idea of what a god's house looked like.
And nowhere better than here, the best preserved temple in all Egypt, the Temple of Horus at Edfu.
So that then, standing over there in the gloom, is the very house of the god, magnificently cut from one piece of granite, burnished like silver, standing in a sandstone room. And in that one over there, behind two wooden doors, once stood the god Horus. These houses, you see, were like the first hut ever made on the first mound that ever appeared in the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. And in this hut stood Horus the god, in a papyrus swamp, and you can still see the papyrus swamp inside. For Horus it was who stood in a swamp, and the swamp was at the dawn of creation. Horus was the first bird standing on the first piece of land, here in the heart of this temple. Every Egyptian temple had a lake of creation, and on every Egyptian temple's lake each morning there were certain acts that simulated the creation of the world. And one of these was to do with our friend here, who laid the egg which held, yes it did, didn't it? Had the egg which held two things. It held the atmosphere, which separated the earth from the sky, and it held a goose, which quacked and made the first sound. Go and quack and make the first sound. So we're going to simulate one of these marvellous events. It hasn't been done for 3,000 years, and we're going to launch him onto the lake of creation, just as they did in Karnak, the priest did in Karnak 3,000 years ago. Come on, mate. Here we are. In we go. Whoop. Go on. Go on. Cackle. Come on. That's it. Go on. Down the hole. Go on. Go on.
Nowadays, some of our villagers' most intimate possessions are encased in the great museums of the world.
This little room in Turin probably has more recorded Egyptian history in it than any other room in the world. These, you see, are unrolled rolls of papyrus on which the scribes have written. Here, court records of a royal trial. This, the oldest map in the world. But this papyrus is the one we've come to see. It's a bit of a tatty relic, but the world in it is magic. Look at this little head. It's a little animal playing a double flute. It's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Underneath is a bird climbing a ladder. That's a balmy thing for a bird to do. This bird can't fly. All the animals in this papyrus are actually doing strange and insane things. This is a modern copy because, as you can see, the original's a bit tatty, but you can actually work out what's going on here. And what you see is this absolutely insane world. A donkey, a bad animal being a priest, all sorts of weird, wonderful things in it.
Now, this may look like a comedy, but it's no joke, this basically unstable, topsy-turvy world. And there is another sort of drawing upon this strange papyrus.
They showed 12 couples of the villagers making love. It's an erotic papyrus. It's the only one that survived. Extraordinary document. Just think about it. What it shows you, in this one long, thin strip, you can divide it down the middle. One half is stressless, tenderful, loving, centerfold, if you like, no time in it at all. The other side, all these mad, crazy animals doing weird things. It's a villager's subconscious, you can say. You're actually looking right into somebody's mind. I can tell you more about that inside of their mind, too. I can tell you that about 5% of the villagers' dreams were concerned with making love. How do I know such a thing? Well, we actually have a book of dreams from the village. It gives you a list of 400 or 500 dreams and gives you interpretations. So you can say, for example, that if you dream you're eating crocodile flesh, you're going to become a tax inspector. If you dream you making love to your wife in public, bad, 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 anxiety dream, that is. So, there's a lot of anxiety in the dreams, by the way. Can you imagine 15% of them are about loss of face, fear that your words wouldn't be understood in a village. So, you've got to think of our villager laying in bed. Bang, he has this awful dream. He wakes up. He's, oh my God, there's a terrible interpretation in the papyrus. What can I do? Well, the papyrus actually tells you what you can do. What you do is, you get up, you go down to the cellar, and you eat a lot of bread and drink a lot of beer, and you have a prayer. Oh God, Isis, don't let it happen to me.
And right through the villagers' most secret thoughts and during their most private acts, there was a single god who looked deep into their hearts.
The village oracle was an especially sacred statue of the king Amenhotep I, the man who had founded the village and probably who laid in the first tomb the villagers ever made. His shrine was the most revered, set high amongst the other temples of the village. And it was from there that the statue was sometimes carried by the villagers on little processions, like the great statue of Amun-Ra at Karnak. They took him, for instance, to the Valley of the Kings. There he would be carried over the mountains with all the workmen laughing and singing in front of the statue. When they got to the valley, they'd put the god down and have a good drink and eat the special cakes they'd made. Good time was had by all, and they brought the god back at night. It was like a little outing for him. But probably the most important function of the god was as a sort of a safety valve for the village problems, because people used to ask the god questions. Sometimes, for example, he'd be taken down the village high street, and there people would come out of their houses and ask the god, "Who has taken my mat?" or "Will my boy get promotion?" or "How long will my father live?" And the god would answer them. And it was on one of these occasions that a sculptor came out of the house and asked the god to find his stolen clothes. So the village magician was sent for. He walked along in front of the procession, and as they passed each house, he shouted out the name of its owner. The house of Kaha, the house of Senejum, the house of Nefer. And then slowly, as the procession moved down this part of the high street, it ground to a halt here, right in front of scribe Amennakht's house. It must have been a terrifying moment for him. After all, there was this god accusingly standing outside his front door. And he rushed out and he addressed the god directly. He said, "These clothes of which you speak, did my daughter really take them?" And the god said that she had. So you can imagine the rather crestfallen scribe went back inside, saw his daughter, and together sorted out the clothes and gave them back to the man who'd accused them. Now, we don't actually know whether these clothes were in some sort of a dispute or whether his daughter was a thief. That's as far as the story goes. But how, you may ask, did the god actually manage to say yes or no to anything? How did the stone statue move? Well, what really happened was that as the bearers moved with the god, his power came into their shoulders. So as they marched down the high street, in this particular part, the statue pressed down on them so hard that they couldn't move. And when Amennakht asked his question, the answer was indicated by the god nodding backwards and forwards. That's how the god delivered his verdict. Such strange things still happen at Luxor, which is a part of ancient Thebes, built on it indeed. Take that mosque over there, Mosque of Abul Hajjaj. That's built in amongst the columns of the Luxor temple. As many Egyptologists would like to know what it says on the texts that are buried in the walls of the mosque. So they must have been pretty delighted when in about 1935, King Farouk donated the mosque on which I'm standing to hold the remains of the great saint who was buried in the mosque. And a strange thing happened when the engineers turned up to move the saint, the old man who'd come from Baghdad to convert all of Luxor to Islam. They found that when they approached his tomb to lift his body and bring it to his new mosque, that they froze, they couldn't move. It's exactly the same thing that happened when the pallbearers carrying the oracle went past Amennakht's house. They froze too. It's exactly the same situation. And as the oracle pointed the finger at Amennakht's daughter, so the old saint still lies in his tomb. And the Egyptologists are still wondering what's buried underneath it. When Amennakht first became a scribe to work in the royal tombs, the artists were in the doldrums. You get the feeling when you look at their work, because this is all was done about that time, that they were really knocking it out. The life had gone out of the work. And that really is the severest test of Egyptian art. Does the guy look like he's alive? Does the eye look like it might see you? Does the arm look like it might move? Well, I think if you look at this arm very quickly, you'll see that this angle there is so badly drawn, it just doesn't articulate properly. It doesn't look as if it could ever swing. That's because the first process in this work was badly done. These walls, you see, were left white, and then the master draftsman came in and drew the lines that the sculptors would then engrave on the wall. The ancient Egyptians described it. They said, outline draftsman, then graven by chisels, and then coloured. And that's what you've got here. But look, the outline draftsman is really not too worried about the king as a living man. He's just earning his bread, shuffling quickly round the face, miserable little lips that you can hardly see.
a snake that's wobbling around on a little thin stick and isn't really alive, an ugly, clunking wig. All this contrives to turn it into a rubber stamp for us, I think. Amennakht himself was a painter, and he designed and painted coffins all his life, even after he became scribe. And you can see his impact in the tombs in the 20 years he worked here. In fact, together with his sons, one of whom became the master colour artist, he really oversaw a renaissance in the royal tombs, so that this poor and miserable and lifeless figure blossomed into the wonderful paintings of the later kings. This is probably the only tomb in the Valley of the Kings where you can actually see the master draftsman working on a wall. It's my favourite tomb in the valley, actually. It's probably one of the greatest tombs of Egyptian art, and it's still a bit secret. Not many people know about this tomb or its wonderful drawings. It's the tomb of this man, a bit bashed up here, Prince Montuher, a man who was in charge of the royal chariotry. But it's the artists that are more interesting than the prince here, really. Let's just look at one line. So that's how you really get to see the quality of these painters. Look at this arm here. It runs down, runs along. And then in another colour, it starts up there again. Now, the artist, before he made that line, because that line takes a second and a half, has thought that this wonderful costume that the prince is wearing is just going to pull slightly on the king's arm, so the skin is moved down slightly. That's really thinking about it. Before you make the move, you think, I want this quality and I want that quality, and you have the skill in your arm to be able to do it in one single stroke. That's amazing. Actually, it's not just a quality of thought and action, because these guys actually had to make their own paints and brushes. There weren't no tubes about in those days. So all these lovely colours here were ground up on pallets, probably several days before they actually came to work in the tomb. And they did this old test, and it still works for paint today, you know. You get a little dab of the paint, and you put it between two fingernails, and you rub your fingernails together, and you feel the grit there. It's not ground enough, and you have to grind it for another 4 or 5 hours. When it is ground finely enough, and you've left it, then you have to let it stand in the water for a couple of days, because if you don't, when you start drawing these vast long lines here, the little brushes that you use just filter the water from the pigment, and you're left with a line of water. So this is not just incredible skill you're looking at, it's also great sophistication and knowledge of your craft. And what an amazing sophistication it is, too. These lines run for feet after feet after feet in one stroke. That means that the man actually has control in his arm and his arm muscles, almost like a dancer. And that's what this brush is doing, really. It's just sort of dancing through the air. Look at this line down the front of the face here. Very quick, very sharp. He knows exactly where he's going, and he's got the control from the end of his brush to his arm, like a samurai warrior, you know. I mean, you can just do it. That's really amazing brushwork. And he's thinking all the time. See, these wigs are made of wool, so to get a nice edge, to describe their texture, the artist has mixed a bit more water with his paint. He's run it loosely down the edge, and that really has all the textures on the person are described. The sharp gold necklace, the little tassel that wrinkles on it, that holds it, the tassels of the robe. It's all carefully described, carefully worked out with great thought. So, that's the attention this lucky prince got by his artists. Here you can see him in a succession of scenes. He's worshipping gods, the prince worshipping one god after another down the wall. And you know, in the end, the most amazing thing about this tomb is that you can date it so accurately, that this prince is stuck like a fly in amber. Because these scenes have been going on for thousands of years. They're timeless. But this prince, with all his nice new clothes and his great wigs and his special jewellery, he comes from 1140 BC, exactly. By Montuher time, some 20 kings have been entombed in the Royal Valley. It must have been the greatest treasure chest of the ancient world, the Fort Knox of its day. Imagine the incredible wealth, gold and precious stones, all quarried from the mountains of Egypt, reburied in these cliffs. gold, the very skin of the gods. And there were plenty of Thebans and foreigners brave enough to try to rob the dead kings, and not to collect their treasure either, but to smash it up and smelt it down. Ranged against the thieves was a police force. Before the modern road was cut, the entrance to the Royal Valley looked like this: a small stairway leading to a narrow cleft in a rock face. And around the closed valley, a ring of little watchtowers looked down upon the royal tombs. The valley was so quiet that any sound, a footfall, a chisel's blow, would rise like the whisperings in a cathedral dome. The royal tombs stood open to view, shut off from the world only by thin cedar doors. But in fact, much more guarded these ancient kings than these snakes, spitting their magic venom at ancient thieves. For the police regularly inspected the door seals and would have quickly detected a break-in.
So the robbers had to find other ways into the royal tombs. They either made their own tunnels or came in through other doors, through old tombs, long since empty. It was in the very last chamber of the old tomb that the robbers found what they had come for. It was this, a pile of chippings. And at the back of the pile of chippings, some plaster and some stone rudely stuffed into a hole. And this hole, they knew, led down into a royal tomb beneath them. That's where they broke through. Then the men all tumbled down their rope, jumped onto the floor of the royal tomb. And then, of course, it was just a short scramble through here, down to the doors of the royal burial chamber. All that stood between them and the king laying in his burial chamber was a thin cedarwood door which stood here, with small seals which they broke, threw the door open, and the probably frightened men by now tumbled down these steps into the royal burial chamber. In the centre stood the king, and around him, all the goods of his court. I suppose they quickly stripped those, but the real nut, the real pearl of the whole piece was the mummy of the king himself laying inside his sarcophagus. So they pushed the lid off, and it smashed as it hit the floor, and I'm standing on the bits. They took the royal body out, tore into the mummy bandages, stripped all the jewellery from him, ripped off the royal heart scarab, took the bracelets from his wrists, and all the gold leaves that were down his body, threw that to one side, discarded, took his coffins, which were still covered in gold, and took them from the tomb to spoil at their leisure.
Thieving was now widespread throughout the ancient cemeteries of Egypt. Most of the gangs included a boatman who would ferry the thieves away from the plundered graves, sometimes landing them upon an island where they would set fire to their loot and distribute the melted drops of gold amongst themselves. Fortunately, old scribe Amennakht had not lived to see the plunder of the royal tombs, but his son, scribe Harshire, had, and he was very worried. For some of the robbers were tombmakers, members of his own family who lived in the village. And although Thebes was a large city, it was a tight-knit community. Gossip spread through it like wildfire. It was very difficult to keep secrets. In an effort to forestall the arrest of the villagers, Harshire hit upon a cunning scheme. He would pass off the villagers' crime upon other gangs of tomb robbers. So he made an official report to the mayor of Thebes, telling that the royal tombs had been robbed, forcing him to investigate. A grand committee was convened and crossed the river, travelling all around the myriad royal cemeteries, examining the seals upon the tombs' doors in a 2-day inspection. The tombmakers held their breath. Then the news spread. Through the temples and into the village, they were in the clear. They must have sighed with relief. But then it was that they made their fatal mistake. Not knowing scribe Harshire's plan, they all piled into ferry boats and crossed the river to confront the mayor, the man who they thought had been their accuser, in a great victory celebration.
So the villagers poured down here to the temple of Karnak, down this very path, in a great happy mob. Actually, it's really a political expression because they were celebrating the uncomfortable defeat of their accuser, the mayor. They were out to find his house now for a celebration in front of it. Well, the mayor's house has long gone to dust, but certainly was in a few feet of where I'm walking at the moment. What we do have, and perhaps there's even more remarkable, is the record of the exact conversation that passed between him and the angry villagers. Well, they got to the house, and there was one hell of a row. The mayor came to the door and met them and said, "You have rejoiced at me over the very door of my house. What do you mean by it? I'm the prince who reports to the king." But by now the villagers were in full flight, and they said, "All the kings, together with their royal wives and their royal mothers and the royal children who rest in the great and noble necropolis," that's the Valley of the Kings, "are protected and insured forever and ever." And now the mayor was very angry, because he knew they had been robbing the tombs, and he said then, "Your deeds belie your words." And at that moment, really, they'd sealed their own fate, because the mayor was going to get them.
The first thing he did was to isolate the village. Despite all scribe Harshire's frantic efforts, the donkey trains that brought their food were stopped, and the villagers, dependent upon the state for their food, slowly began to starve. A beady eye was fixed on the villagers, and their movements were restricted. The thieves' loot, still in the village houses, could not now be moved or hidden.
And then disaster struck. They had a house-to-house search of the village, and they found a lot of gold and silver. And as usual, they didn't actually arrest the bosses, of course, but the deputy foreman and 3 members of each gang. And then they brought them and their loot here, across the river. They imprisoned them in a temple. And that is what I'm looking for. Yeah, that's what we've come to see. Here's the king. Here's his name. Here's his hands. And here, a bit bashed up, is a goddess. In her hat, she wears a feather. Now, this feather is the feather that when you die and are called up for judgment, goes on one half of a pair of scales, just like the scales on the Old Bailey, right? And on the other side goes your heart. And if the feather weighs more than your heart, the crocodile eats you up. And that, of course, is why the men came here, because this is her temple. It's the temple of justice, the temple of Mart. And this is where they imprison the 8 villagers. Can you imagine? Poor old scribe Harshire came across the river and sat probably on this very stone and looked through the grill. There was a door there, you see, and he looked through the grill. And he thinks, despite all his efforts, they've got them. They've got a lot of members of his family, really. They've got his younger brother and his 3 sons, got an uncle and his 3 sons. And the scribe's helpless, he can do nothing. And that evening he goes away. And then for 24 days, those guys are questioned, and they are questioned, and lists are made, and lists, and their arms are twisted, because this is not a court of law, really. They're not actually deciding whether these guys are guilty or innocent. What they're doing is trying to get the loot back. So that's why they're making these lists all the time. And really, in the end, the terrible agony they're going through, because it is agony, it's pretty bad torture, the end only comes when they've got that money back. Well, what did you do in 1107 BC when you won the pools? Because that's about what these guys had done. They ripped off a jackpot, really, when you think that the foreman had made about 50 years' salary and the other robbers with him had made about 25 years. That's a lot of money together. So the lists that they made, the confessions, are absolutely fascinating. Like a cross-section of Theban life, really. So what did they do with all their loot? Well, they came from a poor village, so with some of it, they bought food. But after all, food was still relatively inexpensive. So there were lots of other things they could get. They went out and bought themselves new linen clothes, lovely sandals. They bought good, strong beer, meat, cooking oil, all sorts of wonderful things. And from all the women that are on the records, without apparently performing any function, you can imagine a good deal of wine, women and song went on as well.
But those days were over now. The 8 men were taken back across the river, but they never went back to their village. Probably, in the end, they were tied to wooden stakes in the desert and simply left to die. And even after this, the villagers were not let off the hook.
The vizier saw to it that they had no rations for another 3 weeks, and they starved. Then one day he turned up again in Thebes and brought the whole village here to the Valley of the Queens. He was going to teach them a lesson at first hand. He brought them to this tomb here, the very tomb that the 8 men robbed. There's its door. Of course, the tomb door looked nice and shut. It's nice white ceilings down the front, absolutely untouched, unrobbed, it so seemed. Because, of course, if you remember, the 8 men had got in the back of the tomb to rob it. So the vizier had the door took down. And to nobody's surprise, of course, the inside was smashed to fragments. The sarcophagus was in pieces, the coffins were smashed up and everything. The villagers must have looked very shamefaced indeed. And the vizier turned on them and said, "Don't do that again." And he let them have their rations because they've been starving now for a long time.
But the villagers' humiliation did not stop there. Although the vizier had restored their rations, the donkey trains did not come to the village bringing their food. And still starving, the villagers walked down from their village, past the great state temples, and across the green fields to the vizier's state barge that was moored at the riverbank. And there they pleaded with him. And then, and only then, he finally relented and gave them bread from his own food stores and ordered them back to work immediately. And in the paintings the village artists made at this time in the king's tomb, something of the nightmare of those months remains. The royal underworld seems haunted by spectres of the villagers' own sufferings.